Hello everyone, and welcome to a Glassnode report where we are going to be covering the fall of the FTX empire. Now, this is obviously a very significant and quite dramatic event that's happened in the industry. It isn't good, and what I really want to do is just explore some of the details. What we've certainly found, our data science team has been doing a lot of work trying to understand what's been going on, understanding the flow of funds between FTX and Alameda, and Binance. And really, I just want to give you a bit of an update on essentially what we've found to date. Just give you a bit of an overview so you understand what's going on, some of the mechanics about what's happening. Now, look, this is obviously going to be an evolving story. It is going to change and things will be different, almost hour by hour at the moment. So this is a bit of a read at the moment. And we're going to skip all the intro stuff. I'm going to get straight into the analysis just so I can get this out so you can really just see what's been going on. Because I know that times like this can be very challenging. I hope that you're all okay. This can be a really, really difficult time. Bitcoin bear markets are unforgiving. So if you do have any questions or queries, please do reach us in the comments. More than happy to answer those as they come through. Anyway, let's get stuck into the analysis. Okay, so we're going to go through really three different topics here. The first thing we're going to look at is a bit about the relationship between Alameda, FTX and Binance, just understanding the flow of funds so you can kind of see the scale of this thing. I'm just going to talk through the data. Obviously, we still have to wait for what the true details look like, but at the moment, it doesn't look overly good. We're then going to look at token balances and just understand what happened during the event in terms of the actual flow of funds and kind of the state of affairs. And then we're going to close out by looking at the Bitcoin side of the equation and trying to assess exactly what Bitcoiners are doing, given the chaos. And again, this thing will evolve over the course of the weekend, and there'll be more of an update on the week on chain. We'll really explore this in much more detail. So what we're looking at here up the top, and we did put out a tweet thread from Glassnode. You'll find that in the description below. On the left-hand side here, we're looking at the token flows in USD denomination from Alameda. So Alameda has a wallet. Let's just consider that there's three entities in this equation. There's Alameda, there's FTX, and there's Binance. And we're essentially looking for the flow of funds between those entities and comparing it to all the other entities that coins are flowing around to. So this left-hand side chart is a relative chart. So from 0 to 100%. Of all of the funds that are flowing out of Alameda's wallets, where are they going? And as you can see, it maintains, and this is about a year of data, going back to pretty much the market all-time high, 8th of November, 2021. So we're really looking at 1 year of data for all these charts. We can see that 90% of all transaction activity from Alameda was going into FTX. 9% of it was going into Binance. So what we can really see is that there's a flow of funds from Alameda towards FTX, and it is the dominant proportion of what they're actually sending, right? So a very, very significant, and then 1%, you can see all these tiny sections up the top here, about 1% was going elsewhere. Now, when we look at the inflow patterns into FTX, now we're only looking here at coins that are flowing from known entities. We're not talking about individual deposits. This is Alameda and various other exchanges. Much the same story. This is a cumulative sum of all of the tokens that were flowing from Alameda. Now just for reference, these are tokens excluding ETH and BTC. We'll explore those more in more detail shortly. This is looking at everything from stablecoins to FTT tokens, and really they're the dominant format. So really we're looking at tokens here excluding the two majors, ETH and BTC. Now, over the course of the last year, Alameda to FTX accounted for $49 billion worth of token inflows. And as you can see, is the vast, vast majority. So in terms of inter-exchange, there's very little transfer volume on a relative basis going from Binance to FTX, from Bitfinex, from Coinbase, from Kraken, from KuCoin. Alameda into FTX was by far and away the largest depositor of these known entities, right? So we're removing all the individuals here. What we're looking at is institutions and inter-exchange transfers. So what this really tells us here is that there is a bit of a flow of funds where Alameda sits in between the flow of funds, essentially depositing to FTX, so coming out of Binance into FTX. Now, if we look at the makeup of Alameda's wallet, that's what this chart here is looking at. In general, we can essentially, it typically hovered around $200 million. You can see that it started to decline as we got into the last couple of months. Then you can see all the activity that was going on earlier on, that really starts to decline. Now, the token makeup of Alameda's wallet was what we would generally consider to be the higher quality collateral. Stablecoins of various forms, USDC, Tether, DAI, and Ethereum and WBTC. So for the Ethereum wallet of Alameda, it was primarily using relatively liquid capital, and the vast majority of this was stablecoins. So really what we're starting to describe here is a flow of funds of stablecoins from Binance to Alameda, from Alameda to FTX. This was kind of that flow, and then there was obviously flows going in both directions here. If we look at the token flows into Alameda's wallets, we can see that about $15.5 billion came from Binance to Alameda, and 7.1 went from FTX to Alameda. And you can see that both of these areas are quite significant. You can see that they had operations in other exchanges where they were withdrawing funds from other trades, but you can really see here that there's a strategy being played. Alameda was essentially using Binance and FTX as their primary venues. They were a dominant depositor to FTX itself, much smaller relative to Binance, because Binance is obviously a much, much larger exchange. But really what we're seeing here is that Alameda was almost a middleman between these two exchanges when running their strategies. If we look at the token outflows from FTX, so this is where is FTX's funds going? Again, that same logic, we're looking at the named entities here. You can see that 36% of those flows went to Binance. So you're starting to see a bit of a circle here. Coins go from FTX to Binance, they get withdrawn through Alameda and then back into FTX, and there's this flow of funds. Obviously, it goes the other direction as well, but FTX to Alameda was then 38% of the funds. So the funds coming out of FTX were going primarily to Binance and Alameda at almost an equal split between the two. And then you can see that there's the other entities that we were looking at before that were captured in the flows from Alameda. So these are essentially funds coming out of those institutions into Alameda, highly likely to then be going back into FTX. But what we're looking at here is that FTX would then send those funds back to those other exchanges. So you could start to see these loops playing out. So when we actually break this down, what does it mean? It really suggests that Alameda has been in between many, many transfers on the order of several $billion between Binance and FTX. There's been this kind of flow of funds and also their various other exchanges. It really highlights that these were the two primary venues for Alameda. And sadly, it's increasingly looking like Alameda and FTX were, let's just say, misbehaving and potentially misappropriating funds. That appears to be what the state of play is. It's certainly what the data would tend to suggest. What I don't want to do is kind of postulate too much and speculate, because we do have to wait for just the reality of this thing to come out. So really what we're seeing here is in terms of just the sheer capital moving between these entities, there is a very clear relationship that looks like a kind of a circular flow of funds that appears to be some form of trading strategy, but it really just shows the scale of how, I guess, integral or connected the FTX and the Alameda entities really are, or were, I guess is the right word at this point in time. So now let's move on and look at stablecoin, BTC, Ethereum balances on the two exchanges. On the left-hand side, I have Binance charts. On the right-hand side, FTX. Really just so we can kind of explore the delta between these two, because obviously, one's in a very different position to the other. So in terms of stablecoins, the red curve here is the aggregated top four. So DAI, USDT, USDC, and Tether. So when we combine all of these things together, the top four, Binance USD, we can essentially see that this red curve for Binance has more or less just been in a steady ascent, right? It keeps climbing. You can also see here Tether and USDC losing dominance recently and BUSD picking up. This is how Binance is now essentially moving towards a BUSD standard on their exchange. Now, if we compare that to the stablecoin balance on FTX, it was hovering up here about $700 to $800 million for some time, right? For most of this consolidation range we've been in, and it's essentially at zero. It has seen a complete and total collapse down to zero. This is the bank run. This is essentially what we saw. We saw everybody rush to the exits, and now we're in a position where it essentially looks like CZ and Binance will not be stepping in to save FTX. So it essentially is it's a bank run, and the status of how that plays out over coming years probably remains to be seen. In terms of net flows, we're talking about on the order of several $100 million moving in and out each day. And you can see that FTX has seen a massive, massive outflow, right? Very, very significant outflows of overall funds. Now we can move on to FTT, BTC, and ETH, which is where things get a bit interesting. And what I might just quickly do is scroll back up here and just highlight this $4.2 billion worth of tokens on the 28th of September from Alameda into FTX. Now, for those who are aware, the FTT token was kind of the linchpin in this whole thing that started the implosion, because there was a large amount of leverage applied on top of that. Essentially, Alameda and FTX, their balance sheets were, essentially heavily levered towards the value of the FTT token. So on the 28th of September, we saw, here's that same point, we saw an extraordinary amount, 74,000 up to 250,000 FTT tokens. So essentially that $4.2 billion inflow was essentially Alameda sending a stack of FTT into their FTX balance. Now, whether this was for collateral to whatever is going on, it's obviously a lot of money to be moving around. $4.2 billion in a single transaction. That's significant stuff. And then on the left-hand side here, you can see Binance. This is essentially where Binance moved their sum of tokens, 39 million tokens in total on their balance, up from 1.1. So a very, very significant sum. I think Binance themselves had about 30 million FTT tokens that they transferred onto their exchange. And as you can see, that was essentially what really catalyzed all of the events of the last 48 hours which have happened. So we can really see that there was something wrong as far back here with FTX in late September. There was something in terms of moving these tokens around and trying to reshore things. So it's we can see that this thing has obviously had it's got some history to it. If we look at our BTC balance, right, here's Binance, which, by and large is largely unaffected. We've seen somewhat of an inflow over recent days. It looks like about 30,000 BTC has flowed in. Now, again, this is not the most bizarre thing. You can see this is kind of well within range. So this doesn't really look like a mass panic yet, even though price is pretty nasty. We will be monitoring this and just seeing how this plays out over coming weeks. FTX, on the other hand, this, you can see, has been in a macro decline. And what I would just highlight here is that right after Luna sold off, note how significantly the balance impairment really was. So again, here in September, we saw this FTT flow in. Following Luna, we started to see a massive decline in overall BTC on those balances. It starts to speak to perhaps there was actually balance sheet impairment between the FTX Alameda entity as far back as the Luna collapse. And we know that wiped out a very, very significant portion of capital, took a lot of people by surprise, as many of these events have this year, sadly. And, this is kind of the state of play. So it looks like there was some damage done back then, and it may well have been all kind of baked into the cake by that point in time. And we just really are finding out about it now, which tends to be how financial collapses tend to happen. They come out months later, the damage gets done, and it takes time for it to echo through the system. And sadly, it's likely that this collapse of FTX and Alameda, we will also have some duration ahead of us of extreme uncertainty where we have to wait and see how this all plays out and who is affected. Looking at ETH balances, you can see for Binance, it's much the same, right? They're fairly stable in terms of their overall exchange balance. There's been very little change over recent weeks. It's kind of flatlining. Here, FTX basically gone to zero. So their balance has essentially gone to zero on stablecoins, on BTC, on ETH. It's the definition of a bank run. It's essentially been a, get in there and people have taken whatever they could get out. It is a very sad scenario, but it's also the market that's in front of us. So, we'll try and assess it as it goes, but you can clearly see that, it's not the healthiest looking chart. So now I want to just pivot and have a look at essentially what's the impact, right? What's happened? Well, first thing is that our drawdown is back down to over 73% down from the top. We're now down into March 2020 levels. It's obviously not great. This is kind of how these things play out, and the market is just in a very serious period of uncertainty. Doesn't know what is the contagion effect, how far does this go. We will find out, but This chart here, I think, is actually quite interesting. Now, you will find this chart, we've recently rolled out on our new dashboards in the exchange section. You'll find this chart. What this is looking at is if we start on the 1st of January on every year, let's look at all of the exchange withdrawals. And let's just imagine that's the cost basis, right? All the dollar cost averages and buyers and sellers. You can do this for deposits as well. And they generally come out more or less the same. So for all intents and purposes, this gives us a good enough view. What we're looking at here is basically the class of 2017, class of 2018, 2019. If you started, let's just imagine a dollar cost average regime on the 1st of January 2017 and did it all the way up to now, what would your average cost basis be? That's what these curves are showing. Now, there's a few insights here. At the bottom, we've got the all-time. Right now, it's hovering much, much lower. It's down here around 10,800. Now, what you can see is that the class of 2017 plus, this blue curve here, is about 14,900. So at the time of recording, we're about 15,700. So, you know, we do have this all of 2017 onwards. Cost basis down here just under 15 grand. Now, that's essentially saying that only if you've been here since 2017 and beyond and before are you in profit. It's tough, but you know, if you're essentially a dollar cost averager, we lost the 2018 level at 18,500. This green curve, the class of 2019 has essentially been resistance up here at 22,000 until very recently. Class of 2020 is up here at 27,000. Class of 2022 is actually outperforming class of 2021. Also pretty tough. They're currently sitting up here. So class of 2022 is at 29,000 and 2021's at 39. So, I mean, this is serious pain. And if you've been here for a while, I've been through several of these bear markets before. I'm certainly I'm no stranger to being under the cost basis. And you know, this is essentially what max pain capitulation type levels look like, right? People have been here for 5 years, still underwater on their position. So, you know, this is Bitcoin can be pretty cruel at times, but you know, it's this is why it's designed to be resilient, because it will live to fight another day. Now, this here is the adjusted percent supply and profit. So what we're doing here is trying to remove the coins that are older than 7 years. Let's just take them out of the picture because, you know, once they're older than 7 years, it's pretty unlikely they're going to get spent. And if they are spent, this metric will self-adjust. So the blue curve is just our base level percent supply and profit. Now, what you'll notice if you look at this chart is it typically bottoms out around, you know, 45, 50%, thereabouts. But if we actually take out those lost coins, you know, Satoshi's coins, I don't particularly care that Satoshi's coins are in profit. It's not really useful information to me. If he spends them, okay, he spends them, and then we can readjust. This metric will auto-adjust. But for now, I know he's in profit, and I don't particularly care because it's not relevant in terms of the market dynamics. So this metric has broken down to a new cycle low. We are down here at 31% of supply in profit. This is below March 2020 by some margin, actually, 37%. So an additional, about 6% of supply. We are at the worst level we were in 2018. We've done a report as far back as June that you'll find in our insights page called A Bear of Historic Proportions. And in that report, we essentially came to the conclusion that the sell-off down to 17.5K back in June made this the worst bear market in history. This metric here is essentially telling us that we've essentially gone over and above. We have dotted the T's, crossed the I's, and put a star of excellence on this bear market as being the most horrific from pretty much every angle. So even though we're not even at the lowest drawdown percent, it doesn't really matter because a percentage is just a percentage. The amount of value lost and value destroyed and coins in that just underwater by enormous margins, it just blows everything else out of the water. So, you know, by any reasonable time-weighted, volume-weighted metric, this is the worst bear market that Bitcoin has ever seen. And you know, if you survive this long, man, good resolve, right? That's what Bitcoiners are all about. Now, moving on and looking at the Bitcoin spending behavior, because you know what we want to see in this moment. And again, this is kind of front-face data. We're finding this out as it happens. This will evolve, and you'll see this over coming weeks and reports. I want to see about how are people reacting, right? What are the hodlers doing in particular? I'm not overly fussed. As we said in our previous video on Monday, we're in a hodler-dominated market. I don't particularly care about the speculators because they're more or less exhausted. And I'm also, given today's events, not expecting too many speculators to be coming back anytime soon. So thus, we're in a hodler market. Let's see what the hodlers are doing. So at the top here, we've got our ASOPA and net realized profit and loss. The way to think about these, on the left-hand side, is kind of a relative of all the coins that were spent this day. What is the average percent that they locked in as a profit or a loss? You can see this pretty angry looking wick down here, which got down to, if I can get my cursor right, 0.9. So that means that the average spender was locking in a 10% loss. Now, as you can see, I mean, that may not sound like much, but you have to remember that every single coin that was spent was locking in some kind of loss, and the average was 10%. Most of the time, it's like 2, 3, 4% at most. So these large events, 10% loss, when we saw this in the June wick, the last time we were down here at these angry numbers, we also saw it here in July. It's kind of coincident with down here, it's in the June sell-off that we had. So it's significant, right? It's pretty bad. Now, the right-hand side is the USD value on net. So take all the losses, subtract them from the total realized profits, and we have this chart. Now, you can see here that whilst this is pretty angry on a relative basis, this isn't anywhere near as angry. I mean, it's still $1 billion loss. It's not small change. It's a big number. It is still capitulation worthy, but you can see that it's kind of similar to what we've seen over the last couple of months. It's not the most out of bounds thing we've ever seen. So what that kind of tells me is that we've seen a lot of, this is max pain. This, in terms of like people just getting flushed out and just saying, get me out of this thing, this is what this looks like. This looks a lot more like people are certainly locking in losses, but we're not seeing the ultimate flush out of top buyers. This has been the ultimate flush out of top buyers. This is a much closer to a seller exhaustion capitulation and a lack of demand. That's really what this speaks to me as, and it's kind of coincident with what we've been talking about, that it's a hodler-dominated market. There's a lot of hodlers out there who are like, oh man, all right, okay, we've got time and duration ahead of us, 15K BTC, right, all right, not the best thing in the world, but, has it changed the thesis? Probably not. So we've got a lot more of those folks than we did certainly back here in June. So this process has been flushing out a lot of those speculators, and this is probably going to be, one of a few nails in the coffin to just really solidify that. You can also see that in our realized loss. It's up, but it's also not. It's not horrifically bad. I mean, this thing here is over $4 billion in a day, almost 5. So this here at what's our total realized loss? 1.1 billion. Now, by the way, that net realized profit and loss is 1 billion. Realized loss is 1.1 billion, which means there's only 100 million in profits. Now, that's actually very small, even though it sounds like it's a big number, obviously, but we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar asset here. 100 million in profits, and especially compared to 1.1 billion in losses, really shows that coins from the previous cycle are pretty stationary. They're not moving. Coins that are in profit, of which, as we've discussed, there's not many of them, but from the previous cycle, they're pretty static. Average coin dormancy is the average days or average holding time of coins that was spent, right? So let's actually just jump this back to a 5-year period here. You can see the bull market is very, very significant. I mean, we're talking about numbers that are getting up to like 80, 90 days on average. Capitulation events down here in 2018. I mean, this is just over 200 days. So we're talking about people who are selling coins have held for very, very, on average, for 200 days, right? These are big, big numbers. This is kind of not really showing up too much. So the average age of coins being spent kind of confirms that people from last cycle are just not spending in any kind of volume, which means that it's more than likely current capitulation is from people who just recently bought. Now, we're going to go look at our spent output price distribution. So you may have seen me look at the URPD, which is the kind of overall spread of coins, what their current price bucket is. This one here is essentially looking at only the coins that were spent that day. Now, this is on a log scale, by the way. Here's 10 BTC, right? So if I just put my cursor here, you can pretty much ignore all of this. So previous cycles, typically less than 10 BTC. I mean, 10 BTC is not, it's big for each of us, but it's not big for the market. All these, yeah, okay, sum them all up, you've got a couple of hundred BTC. These ones here are up over 100,000. So compared to this, one of these candles above this 10 is just so many more of these bars. So we can more or less ignore those bars down there. And I'm actually just going to turn this off log scale so we can basically see what that means. All the coins that are being spent right now in any size are essentially from our recent price range. So there's a huge amount of transaction activity where the vast majority of it are people who just bought, right? So it's essentially those same people who are jostling for a low are trying to jostle for another low. We can see this in our long-term holder supply. There's been a downtick, but it's not exactly, I mean, it looks like many of these other little ticks. It almost looks like a pause. And again, we need to just watch. This is obviously very, very front-facing data. We need to look for trends to develop. But we can see here that the amount of maturation that's going on is amazing. It's historic. We will see if this deteriorates, but at the moment, it doesn't yet look like long-term holders are saying, that's it, I've had enough of this thing, get me out. We haven't seen that. Now, I don't know whether we need to see that. I don't think we need to see that, but if we do start seeing that, that would then be a loss of conviction, right? So looking at these metrics, looking for upticks in dormancy, looking for upticks in old coin volume. That's this chart down here, spent old coin volume. So these are coins older than 6 months. And again, you'll find this in one of our recently released dashboards. If we get a significant uptick, right, in this particular model, at the moment, we're talking about 15,000 BTC. It's kind of within the bounds of daily noise. It's nothing compared to what we've seen in previous market drawdowns, 30, 40, 50,000 BTC a day. And the other thing is that our number of addresses with a non-zero balance is just kind of in this stagnant holding pattern. We haven't seen this mass purge that we saw here in May. So anyway, look, the big takeaway here is, let's go top to bottom. Obviously, there's a lot to come out of this story with FTX and Alameda. The data here shows that there was a lot going on between those two entities, and we will find out more about that in the coming weeks and maybe months. In terms of the overall balance, I mean, you can see the difference between Binance and FTX in terms of the way that customers are treating that big particular exchange. FTX, the balances that we're tracking at least are pretty much empty. So it's been a quite significant bank run. It's pretty much cemented this is the worst bear market in Bitcoin history. By no small magnitude. And when we look at the overall supply dynamics, it's kind of the same as what we've seen previously, where the hodlers just seem unfazed. I mean, I don't think they're pleased about the scenario, but they also don't seem to be reacting, at least with their coins just yet. Now, this is something we'll be monitoring, so make sure you check in on Tuesday next week for the week Onchain. We'll be covering this in a bit more detail once we've got a bit more of data and time to really explore what's going on. As always, please do give me any comments. If you have any questions, you can reach us in the comments. You can, ping me on Twitter. You can ping Glassnode on Twitter, whatever it is. We'll try and get around to you. And yeah, look, hopefully everybody's okay. These are challenging times. It's never good when events like this go down. Bear markets are pretty ruthless, and really, really stay safe out there. So anyway, hopefully that reaches you well, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.